Over the past weekend, scenes unfolded in Caracas that captured both national pride and deep anxiety. Thousands of ordinary Venezuelans, civil servants, housewives, retirees lined up to join the Bolivarian militia. They were responding to calls from President Nicolás Maduro to stand ready following the deployment of U.S. Navy warships just off their coast. To them, the message was clear: Venezuela would not be intimidated by American power. The images carried a symbolic weight. They showed citizens in civilian clothes, some elderly, pledging to defend their homeland. Maduro's government quickly announced that more than 4.5 million militiamen were being mobilized alongside the formal armed forces, which had been placed on maximum alert. On the other side, reports indicated that 3 U.S. guided missile destroyers, accompanied by nuclear submarines and an amphibious squadron carrying thousands of Marines, had taken up positions in Caribbean waters near Venezuela. Such deployments are rarely just military maneuvers, they are signals. In this case, Washington signaled its readiness to act against drug cartels that the Trump administration had labeled terrorist organizations. Caracas responded with mass mobilization, not only of soldiers but of ordinary civilians. Both sides understood the stakes. What made the situation even more tense was the uncertainty. Would this remain a show of force, or could it spiral into something far more dangerous? This backdrop sets the stage for a question Americans have heard before. How did the U.S. and Venezuela end up here once again, locked in a cycle of threats and counter-threats? What do you think is the best path forward in this standoff? Should Washington keep up the pressure, or is diplomacy the only way to avoid another costly conflict? If you found this analysis useful, give the video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next deep dive. To understand the present, one must recall a string of political flashpoints that date back several years. In August 2017, during his first term, President Donald Trump told reporters he would not rule out a military option for Venezuela. That single remark sent shockwaves through Caracas. Defense Minister Vladimir Lopez condemned it as madness and supreme extremism. From that point on, relations between the two governments lurched from one heated exchange to another. One figure repeatedly surfaced during this period: Senator Marco Rubio. Known as a fierce critic of Maduro, Rubio even suggested, in at least 2 meetings with Trump officials, that a military invasion should be considered. Those suggestions were rejected at the time, but Rubio's stance left a lasting impression, particularly when he was later appointed Secretary of State in Trump's second term, an unmistakable sign of a hard line toward Maduro. The rhetoric only escalated in early 2025, days before Trump's second inauguration. On January 13, 2025, Maduro floated the idea that Venezuela, supported by Brazil, should invade Puerto Rico to liberate its people. The comment provoked outrage. Puerto Rico's governor, Jennifer González Colón, wrote directly to Trump, warning that Maduro represented an open threat to U.S. national security. Soon after, reports emerged that Trump's team wanted Maduro gone the way of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. While not formal policy, the implication was unmistakable. Regime change was on the table. Concrete steps soon followed. In February 2025, the Trump administration officially designated the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization. In August, the administration doubled the bounty for Maduro's capture from $25 million to $50 million, a sum once reserved for figures like Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. In parallel, another Venezuelan group, the Cartel of the Suns, was declared a global terrorist organization, with U.S. officials alleging Maduro himself was its leader. Attorney General Pam Bondi then announced the increase in the bounty, and Trump signed a directive instructing the Pentagon to use military force against drug cartels labeled as terrorist groups. This directive became the legal basis for deploying U.S. warships to the region. Officially, Washington described the mission as combating narco-trafficking. Yet regional observers noted that the scale of the deployment, a fleet of destroyers, submarines, and Marines, looked less like law enforcement and more like a veiled threat to Maduro's hold on power. Against this backdrop, both Washington and Caracas raised the stakes. Each new move made compromise more difficult and confrontation more likely. For Trump, the hard line bolstered his image as a president unwilling to bow to dictators. For Maduro, the mobilization of millions of civilians reinforced his claim to be the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. Neither leader appeared ready to blink. To fully grasp the choices before Washington, one has to understand Donald Trump's carefully cultivated political image. Throughout his first term and into his second, Trump repeatedly emphasized one theme. Unlike his predecessors, he had never started a war. This was not a minor talking point, but a central part of his brand. He presented himself as a leader who imposed peace through strength, willing to threaten, willing to use overwhelming force if necessary, but always avoiding the long, grinding wars that had cost American lives and trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This self-image resonated with many Americans weary of foreign entanglements. In fact, Trump rose to prominence partly by calling the Iraq War a disaster, a position that set him apart from other Republican candidates in 2016. His critics may argue that his approach was reckless or inconsistent, but his supporters saw in him a president determined not to repeat what they viewed as Washington's worst mistakes. Venezuela became a testing ground for this philosophy. On the one hand, Trump's administration labeled criminal groups like Tren de Aragua and the Cartel of the Suns as terrorist organizations. They doubled the bounty on Nicolás Maduro from $25 million to $50 million, placing him in the same league of notoriety as Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced the increase, and Trump secretly signed a directive instructing the Pentagon to use military force against cartels designated as terrorist groups. These were not half measures. They signaled a willingness to deploy the U.S. military well beyond traditional counter-narcotics missions. On the other hand, Trump continued to insist that if he wanted to invade Venezuela, he would not hide it. Speaking in 2020, he declared that it would not be a small group, but an army. The words were telling. For Trump, military force had to be overwhelming to be credible. Anything short of that, he implied, was posturing. Thus, the deployment of 3 guided missile destroyers, nuclear submarines, and thousands of Marines served less as the first step of an invasion than as a visible reminder of what the United States could unleash if provoked. Trump's political logic rested on 2 pillars. Domestically, taking a hard stance against Maduro and Venezuelan gangs tied neatly into his broader fight against narcotics and illegal immigration, issues central to his support base. Internationally, it allowed him to appear tough on dictators without plunging the United States into another long war. By keeping Maduro on the defensive while maintaining his own freedom of action, Trump preserved both his reputation as a peacemaker and his image as a president, unafraid to act. From this vantage point, analysts outlined 3 scenarios for how the standoff could evolve. Each reflects not only military possibilities, but also the political and diplomatic calculations at play. Scenario 1. No direct invasion, most likely. The first and most likely scenario, given Trump's style, involves maintaining pressure without crossing the threshold into open war. In this case, the United States would continue its naval deployment as a show of force, intensifying sanctions and expanding maritime interdiction operations to choke off narco-trafficking routes. Destroyers such as the Arleigh Burke class, already off Venezuela's coast, equipped with Tomahawk missiles and advanced radar systems, would patrol international waters. Surveillance aircraft like the P-8 Poseidon would fly missions over the Caribbean, collecting communications and intelligence data. The purpose would not be invasion but deterrence, forcing Maduro into a corner where negotiation or exile, perhaps in Russia or Iran, became his only viable options. The risks of this scenario are less about intentional escalation than about accidents. A warning shot fired too close, a misinterpreted radar lock, or a clash at sea could trigger an exchange of fire. Still, in geopolitical terms, this approach avoids the strong international condemnation that an outright invasion would provoke. It weakens Maduro internally by encouraging defections and protests, while allowing Trump to maintain his image as someone who cripples dictators without launching wars. Scenario 2. Precision strikes without ground invasion. The second scenario envisions a short, sharp campaign aimed at crippling Maduro's regime while avoiding occupation. This model would resemble Operation Midnight Hummer against Iran in June 2025. The focus would be on neutralizing key figures within the Cartel of the Suns and possibly Maduro himself through surgical strikes. This would begin with gathering intelligence via satellites, drones, and aircraft such as the P-8 Poseidon to map bunkers and residences in Caracas. Then, F-35 stealth fighters could launch from carriers or U.S. bases, joined by the B-2 Spirit bomber, striking military installations, weapons depots, and command centers. Simultaneously, Tomahawk missiles would be launched from destroyers and submarines positioned offshore. Infiltration by special forces, possibly via submarines, could complement the strikes, seeking to capture high-value targets. The lure of the $50 million bounty on Maduro himself would underscore the stakes. This conflict would likely last only days or weeks. Even if Maduro were neither captured nor eliminated, Trump could present the operation as a victory, proof that he had degraded Venezuela's operational capacity without dragging America into a war. Politically, it would echo the January 2020 strike on Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani, which weakened Tehran's reach without requiring long-term U.S. commitments. Geopolitically, such strikes would isolate Venezuela further and embolden opposition figures like Edmundo Gonzalez, who remained in exile in Spain but was regarded by many as the legitimate president-elect. Scenario 3. Full-scale invasion, least likely. The third scenario, though often discussed, remains the least likely. It would echo Operation Just Cause. This would unfold in 3 phases. Phase 1 would involve massive airstrikes targeting Venezuela's air defenses, radar systems, and military bases. Phase 2 would see amphibious landings, with thousands of Marines storming beaches such as Puerto Cabello, supported by hovercraft and helicopters, to seize control of key facilities. Phase 3 would be a provisional occupation, with special forces like Delta Force hunting Maduro and his inner circle in jungles and mountains, aided by drones for surveillance. Maduro would seek to resist by mobilizing his 4.5 million militiamen trained in asymmetric guerrilla tactics inspired by Vietnam and Afghanistan. Yet their effectiveness would depend heavily on their actual commitment. Given the widespread poverty, fraudulent elections, and the mass exodus of Venezuelan refugees, popular support for Maduro is minimal. Many of those militiamen, poorly trained and ill-equipped, could desert if bombs and missiles began to fall. Still, this scenario collides head-on with Trump's own promise. A full invasion would risk becoming the kind of prolonged war he has vowed to avoid. It is precisely for this reason that most observers consider the likelihood of such an operation very low. Trump may be unpredictable, but he is also keenly aware of the political cost of breaking his reputation as the president who never started a war. While Washington and Caracas dominate the headlines, the reverberations of this standoff extend far beyond their borders. Venezuela's crisis has already shaken its neighbors. Years of economic collapse have driven waves of migrants into Colombia and Brazil, placing enormous strain on public services and security. The deployment of 1,500 Venezuelan troops to the Colombian border, announced as part of the fight against criminal groups, underscored just how intertwined these issues have become. The shadow of great powers also looms over the crisis. Venezuela's air defense systems, including the Anti-2500, were supplied by Russia and continue to rely on Russian operators for maintenance and security. Any U.S. attempt to neutralize those defenses risks a direct clash with Moscow at a time when Trump has been signaling overtures toward peace in Ukraine. Similarly, China has invested heavily in Venezuela's oil and infrastructure, betting on its vast reserves to secure long-term energy needs. Instability threatens not only Caracas, but Beijing's broader economic strategy in the region. Regionally, even countries long critical of Maduro, such as Colombia, remain reluctant to endorse a U.S. invasion. Memories of Iraq and Afghanistan weigh heavily, and no Latin American government wants to be seen as facilitating another U.S.-led intervention. Thus, Washington's options are constrained not only by its own wariness of another quagmire, but also by the absence of reliable regional allies willing to provide bases or logistical support. In this sense, Venezuela has become more than a local crisis. It is a geopolitical crossroads where U.S. domestic politics, Latin American stability, and Russian and Chinese interests intersect. The risk, as many observers warn, is that miscalculation could transform Venezuela into yet another proxy battleground. an outcome that neither the United States nor the region can easily afford. For now, the situation hangs in the balance. The U.S. Navy's presence off Venezuela could just as suddenly be withdrawn as it could be reinforced. The trajectory depends on two central figures: Nicolás Maduro, determined to portray himself as the defender of Venezuela's sovereignty, and Donald Trump, eager to project toughness without breaking his promise of avoiding new wars. The worst-case scenario, of course, is escalation into a broader conflict, one that might draw in Russia, China, and an already unstable Latin America. But there is also another possibility, that the deployment remains primarily about optics, giving Trump leverage to pressure Maduro into concessions, particularly on narco-trafficking. In the end, this standoff is as much about appearances as it is about strategy. For Trump, forcing Maduro to bend, even symbolically, would count as a political win. For Maduro, standing firm feeds his narrative of resistance. And for the world, the hope is that cooler heads prevail, ensuring that this crisis becomes not the opening chapter of a new war, but a footnote in the turbulent history of the 2020s.